Would you take the fall for a crime? If your own sister paid you $50 million to stay quiet? That's not a movie plot. That's the question now echoing through the hills of Brentwood, California. And if Jake Reiner is telling the truth, then everything we thought we knew about the brutal murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner was a lie bought with wire transfers, inheritance threats, and a pact forged in silence. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The kind of silence that only $50 million can buy. You think you've heard shocking Hollywood stories before? This one isn't about fame, or power, or legacy. This is about family, and what happens when trust is replaced with money, and silence becomes the deadliest agreement of all. Jake Reiner has broken the code of silence. He's pulled the curtain back. And what he claims to have witnessed could destroy the Reiner family forever. But let's rewind. Because before the blood, before the betrayal, before the alleged $50 million was quietly wired from one sibling to another, there was a confrontation, a lie, and a single moment where one family member allegedly made a deal that would change all of their fates. The family everyone thought was untouchable. Rob Reiner wasn't just another celebrity. He was America's moral compass in a director's chair. From Stand By Me to The Princess Bride to A Few Good Men. This man didn't just direct films. He directed emotion. Michelle Reiner, his wife of over 3 decades, was by all accounts the calm to his storm. An activist, a mother, a soul rooted in compassion. They were the couple people looked up to. They raised children under the lights of Hollywood, yes. But they also fought for causes, gave to charities, and fiercely protected their family's privacy. But inside the Reiner estate, that lush, ivy-covered Brentwood fortress worth $13.5 million, it wasn't fairy tales and Oscar speeches. Tensions had been building. And now, the picture-perfect image has shattered in ways no one could have predicted. The crime that ripped the illusion apart. Sunday night. A quiet evening in Brentwood was pierced by sirens. Inside the Reiner estate, Rob and Michelle were found brutally stabbed to death. Not in a break-in, not in a robbery gone wrong, but in what police are now calling a domestic double homicide. They didn't find forced entry. They didn't find valuables missing. What they did find was far more chilling. Their 32-year-old son, Nick Reiner, once the troubled, promising young heir to his cinematic legacy, was living on the property in the guest house. He was arrested that night. 2 counts of first-degree murder. The world recoiled. How could he do this? But then came the first tremor. The first fracture in the easy-to-understand crime narrative. Because someone else was there. Romy Reiner, Rob's daughter, the one often kept out of the public eye, had allegedly made a call that night. And in that call, she reportedly told authorities something that changed everything. There's a dangerous family member. They should be a suspect. But she wasn't talking about Nick. A deal made in fear? Or in greed? In the days following the murders, whispers turned into roars. Why did Jake Reiner, the quiet journalist's son, always watching from the sidelines, suddenly come forward? Why did he break from the family's iron wall of silence? According to Jake, there was more than meets the eye. He didn't just see a crime. He saw the prelude, a pact, a transfer, a cover-up. Jake claims that months before the murders, Tracy Reiner, Rob's daughter from his marriage to Penny Marshall, wired $50 million to Nick. $50 million. Not as a gift, not as inheritance, but as a silence pact. Jake alleges this was all connected to a confrontation between Rob and Tracy over manipulated inheritance documents, and that afterward, Tracy acted fast, wiring the money to Nick under one condition. If anything went wrong, if someone found out about the inheritance lies, Nick would take the fall. That's not a typo. That's the core of what Jake is now revealing. That Nick, the one who's been arrested and charged, may not just be a murderer. He might be a scapegoat, a fall guy, paid, silenced, framed, or complicit. Jake doesn't claim to have all the answers. But what he does say is that this money changed hands, and when it did, the family changed with it. The $50 million pact, when silence has a price tag. Let's pause. $50 million is not hush money. It's insurance. This wasn't a payoff to make a problem disappear. This was a payout to contain damage, and to buy something far more valuable than words. Loyalty, or at least obedience. Think about this for a moment. What would have to be at stake for a family member to preemptively pay another family member to stay quiet? And more chillingly, how does this relate to two brutal murders that happened just months later? Jake alleges this wasn't a one-time betrayal. This was a slow-moving train wreck that everyone saw coming, but nobody stopped. He says Rob confronted Tracy, that the patriarch had started asking uncomfortable questions about financial documents. That tempers flared, that accusations were made, and just days later, quietly, a staggering amount of money moved between accounts. Why now? Why Jake? So why is Jake speaking now? Because the silence is broken. Because the blood is real. Because his parents, the people who gave everything, are gone. And if what Jake believes is true, then their deaths may have been the final act in a play that began with money, lies, and betrayal. Jake's not pointing fingers blindly. He's showing patterns, timelines, motives. He's not playing the media circus game. He's sounding the alarm. And he's daring the world to look past the headlines and ask the uncomfortable questions. The audience must decide. This isn't just a whodunit. This is a why was it allowed to happen? Because if a silence pact exists, if $50 million changed hands to keep one sibling quiet about another's lies, and if that sibling ended up taking the fall for murder, then we are not looking at a simple crime. We are looking at a carefully constructed escape plan. And someone, maybe more than one, might still be walking free. So ask yourself, would you keep a secret for $50 million? Would you go to prison to protect your blood? Or would you blow it all up? Like Jake just did? Because according to him, the deal was signed long before the first knife was drawn. And the silence? That was always part of the plan. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. How does a family go from golden legacy to murder headlines? It starts with what you don't see. To the world, the Reiners were untouchable. Hollywood royalty. Moral icons wrapped in directorial brilliance and velvet red carpets. Rob Reiner was more than just a filmmaker. He was a voice, a cause, a presence. Michelle Reiner, his wife, wasn't just his partner. She was the gentle current behind the current. Quiet, constant, kind. They were the family that never made the tabloids, until now. But beneath the surface of award speeches, political activism, and Instagram smiles, something far darker was brewing. A war. Not on screen. In their bloodline. And the public had no clue just how deep it went. The perfect public mask. Think about this. How many celebrity families don't fall apart? Now consider this. The Reiners didn't appear to fall apart until they were already shattered. This wasn't the Lohans. Not the Jacksons. Not even the Royals. The Reiners kept their drama tucked behind garden hedges and controlled press appearances. It's easy to fool the world when the world wants to believe you're one of the good ones. But here's the contradiction that makes this story twist in your gut. How can a family built on storytelling have buried their own story so deep for so long? Because from the outside, the Reiner household looked like something out of a liberal suburban fantasy. Rob, politically outspoken, always championing justice. Michelle, private, elegant, philanthropic. Their children, quiet, rarely seen, carefully distanced from scandal. But Hollywood is performance. And this was a masterpiece of illusion. The forgotten Reiner, Nick's role in the shadows. You've probably never heard much about Nick Reiner before all this. And that's not by accident. Nick, now 32, had always been the quiet one. But not the harmless kind. Not the prodigy. Not the activist. He was the whisper. The one who didn't walk red carpets, but paced back hallways. He had a public battle with addiction years ago, briefly mentioned in interviews, mostly glossed over. He even co-wrote a film based on his experience. It looked like a redemption arc. But inside the family, that redemption never came. Nick reportedly felt left out, isolated, second tier. While Rob's public statements painted a picture of support and love, privately, tensions simmered. Jake, the clean-cut journalist's son. Tracy, the assertive sibling with Hollywood pedigree. Romy, the mysterious daughter who rarely spoke but always saw. And then, Nick, the shadow on the porch. Why was he living in the guest house of his parents' estate? Not in his own place. Not across town. In their backyard. That detail alone tells you something wasn't quite right. But no one was asking. Because silence, again, was the currency of this family. Tracy Reiner, the strategist in heels. Then there's Tracy. Tracy Reiner has always had an edge. She's not just Rob's daughter. She's Penny Marshall's too. Hollywood royalty on both sides. She's produced. She's acted. She's networked like a pro. But Jake, in his statement, didn't call her ambitious. He called her calculated. And that word has been bouncing off the courtroom walls ever since. Jake alleges that Tracy had been positioning herself for years, behind the scenes, to control the family's financial legacy. Not with violence. With documents. With accounts. With quiet manipulations no one wanted to believe. The golden daughter. The one everyone trusted. What if she was quietly rewriting the script? And casting roles for the rest of the family without them knowing? Behind closed doors, a house divided. Let's zoom in. There's the family estate. $13.5 million of manicured luxury. Inside, you've got parents nearing their 80s. Their health reportedly stable, but concerns brewing. Then you've got the guest house. Nick's domain. Out of sight, out of mind, but close enough to hear every argument. And the arguments? Jake says they were getting louder. Specifically, between Rob and Tracy. Not about Nick. Not about careers. About money. Jake claims he witnessed, or was told about, heated discussions between his father and Tracy regarding inheritance allocations, inconsistencies in legal paperwork, and missing clauses that favored Tracy disproportionately. When Rob began pressing for transparency, Tracy allegedly pushed back. Hard. And the family's unspoken rule, never let outsiders in, was once again upheld. No police. No lawyers. Just the Reiners and their secrets. But one of those secrets was about to cost them everything. The night the mask cracked. It didn't happen in a dramatic scene. There was no table flip. No screaming match on the front lawn. It was a conversation. Jake describes it as a calm explosion. The kind where voices stay low, but the words cut deeper than any knife. Rob reportedly confronted Tracy in the main house. Details are murky, and Jake won't confirm how he knows. But what he does say is this. That night, Tracy's tone changed. Not defensive. Not angry. Terrified. Why? Because according to Jake, Rob had uncovered evidence. He found something, we don't yet know what, that he believed proved Tracy had altered legal documents regarding his estate. If that's true, it would be fraud. And Rob? He wasn't about to stay silent. But neither was Tracy. Jake claims it was after this confrontation that she wired the money. The hidden deal begins. $50 million. Transferred quietly. Not publicly documented. Jake says he only learned about it later, through a source he won't name. But the timing? It was days after the alleged confrontation. And weeks before the murders. Coincidence? Or contingency? Jake calls it the silence pact. And it wasn't just about inheritance. It was about leverage. Tracy, allegedly, made Nick an offer. Stay quiet about the inheritance lie. And if something goes wrong, take the heat. Be the black sheep. Own the chaos. Protect the legacy, even if it costs your life. Jake believes Nick agreed. Not because he's evil. Not because he wanted to kill. But because, for the first time, he was finally important. The family that watched it happen. So where were the others? Jake. Romy. Extended family. Staff. This is the question that chills the audience every time. How does a family fall apart this quietly, this violently, and no one says a word? Because they were trained not to. This was a family that made a living scripting stories and burying their own. But Rob's death? That wasn't fiction. And Jake's decision to speak? That wasn't performance. That was detonation. He lit the match. And the flames are just beginning to burn. But in the ashes of the perfect family, the real story was just beginning to emerge. Because while Jake had exposed the alleged pact, no one was ready for what happened the night Tracy's wire transfer hit Nick's account. What does it feel like to be the one person your family hopes will disappear, but can't afford to lose? That's the contradiction that defined Nick Reiner's entire life. Not villain, not victim, not even misunderstood, just misplaced. The forgotten heir, the unstable sibling, the liability who stayed close because no one could risk what he might say if he drifted too far. And maybe that's why, if Jake's claims are true, Tracy didn't just send Nick a wire transfer. She sent him a leash. The golden cage of the guest house. Let's revisit that $13.5 million Brentwood estate. Lush gardens. Mediterranean architecture. Security cameras tucked under eaves. The kind of place you drive past and whisper, who lives there? Answer, Rob and Michelle Reiner, but also living on the property, just yards away from the main house, Nick Reiner. In the guest house. Sounds innocent enough, right? Lots of families let adult children move back home. But this wasn't post-college. Nick was 32. No steady career. No public role in the Reiner family image. Just there. Like an unspoken problem everyone agreed not to mention. Now here's where it gets unsettling. Why wasn't Nick living on his own? Why wasn't he, with that kind of family wealth and opportunity, building a career, living across town, starting a family? Why was he kept in the backyard, like an unsolved problem? Jake Reiner's testimony suggests it wasn't just parental concern. It was control. Control through closeness. Control through surveillance. Because when you're afraid of what someone might do or say, the last thing you want is distance. You want them close, visible, contained, watched. And if that's true, then Nick wasn't just a troubled son. He was a threat management strategy. The tension no one talked about. Families like the Reiners don't air dirty laundry. Not to the media, not to friends. Sometimes, not even to each other. But sources close to the family. Insiders who've started speaking now that Jake has shattered the silence describe the family dynamic as eggshells layered over lava. There were fights, not loud ones, passive-aggressive ones, long silences at dinner, sudden changes to holiday plans, phone calls that ended mid-sentence. Nick had tried. He had. He co-wrote the 2015 film Being Charlie, loosely based on his own struggles with addiction. It was his attempt at redemption, through storytelling, the family trait. But the film underperformed. Hollywood shrugged. And Nick, once again, slipped into the shadows of his more stable siblings. Jake, the respected journalist. Tracy, the industry insider. Romy, the quiet observer. Nick, he was the one who couldn't stay clean. The one who never finished anything. The one who made mom cry. Do you feel it now? The weight of that identity. The way it corrodes self-worth and slowly poisons a person from the inside. Now add this. What if that person was suddenly handed $50 million? The wire transfer nobody was supposed to know about. According to Jake's allegations, Tracy wired $50 million to Nick just weeks before Rob and Michelle were murdered. Not in cash. Not in duffel bags under the bed. In plain financial terms. A wire. A record. A transaction. But no one outside the family knew about it until Jake spoke out. Why? Because if what Jake is saying is true, this wasn't a gift. This was a payout. A deal. A pact with dangerous implications. Jake alleges Tracy made Nick an offer. Stay quiet about the alleged inheritance fraud. Take the blame if the confrontation with Rob ever spiraled. Protect the legacy. And in return, financial freedom. Unprecedented power. The one person no one took seriously suddenly had the one thing that made him untouchable. $50 million. But was that power? Or a prison? Nick's shifting behavior. Neighbors began noticing changes in Nick. He stopped going out. Stopped picking up groceries himself. Security footage, which authorities have yet to release, allegedly shows him pacing the guest house grounds at odd hours. Talking to himself. On the phone, sometimes yelling, sometimes crying. One neighbor told reporters anonymously. He used to nod and wave. But the last few weeks, it was like he was carrying something. Inside. Heavy. Another described hearing a loud argument echoing from the main house the week before the murders. Was that the final confrontation? Or was it the fallout from the wire transfer? Jake believes the money didn't bring peace. It amplified the pressure. Because once Nick took that money, if he really did, there was no way out. No redemption arc. No second chance. Only obligation. And if Tracy's alleged offer included taking the fall for anything that might go wrong, then every moment after that transfer was borrowed time. But what did Nick know? This is the question Jake keeps pressing. If the money was about silence, what exactly was Nick staying silent about? Was it really just about inheritance? Or was there something deeper, something more dangerous, that Tracy didn't want exposed? Jake doesn't speculate in public, but his implication is clear. Nick knew something. Something that, if revealed, would destroy reputations and careers. Maybe even send people to prison. So instead of revealing it, he accepted the deal. And if Jake is right, he accepted the blame, even before the crime happened, the night of the murders. We won't go into graphic detail here. That's not what this story is about. But here's what authorities have confirmed. Rob and Michelle Reiner were found stabbed to death inside their Brentwood home. No signs of forced entry. No valuables taken. Their son, Nick, was arrested on-site and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But here's the catch. According to Jake, Nick didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't even resist arrest. He waited, calm, alone, still wearing the same clothes from hours earlier. Does that sound like panic? Or does it sound like acceptance? Like someone who already knew how this story would end. Like someone who, whether guilty or not, believed he had to take the fall. Because that was the deal. That was the price. And $50 million doesn't come without consequences. Jake's revelation changes everything. Jake didn't want to speak. By his own admission, he wrestled with it for weeks. But after seeing his parents lowered into the ground, after seeing Nick, the brother he barely spoke to, dragged away in cuffs, and after learning about the money, he couldn't stay silent. Because Jake knew what the media didn't, what the public couldn't imagine, what prosecutors hadn't yet connected. This wasn't about an outburst. This wasn't about addiction, or rage, or revenge. This was about a deal. A silence pact. A family cover-up. A desperate strategy to protect something bigger than any one member. And Nick? He was the designated casualty. The brother meant to stay quiet. To obey. To disappear. But what if he didn't? What if Nick, cornered, disillusioned, maybe even betrayed by Tracy, decided to rewrite the pact? What if he fought back? Or worse, what if the deal was broken before the night even began? What if the murders didn't start with a knife, but with a document? Because long before police tape wrapped around the Brentwood estate, long before sirens cut through the night air, the real damage may have already been done, quietly, legally, and in ink. This is where the story stops being about emotions and starts being about control. Because when families fight over inheritance, they're not fighting over money. They're fighting over power, over validation, over who mattered most and who never did. And according to Jake, that fight had already crossed a line. The lie hidden in plain sight. Inheritance disputes usually explode after someone dies. That's what makes this different. Jake alleges the argument over Rob's estate happened while he was still alive. And while he was still sharp enough to notice something was wrong. That alone should make you pause. Rob Reiner was meticulous. A storyteller obsessed with structure, clarity, and intent. This wasn't a man who forgot where he put things. So when Jake says Rob began asking questions about his estate documents, it wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Something didn't add up. Clauses had changed. Percentages didn't match previous drafts. Certain beneficiaries appeared favored. Quietly, disproportionately. And every road led back to one person. Tracy, the trusted insider. Tracy had access. That's the detail people keep glossing over. She wasn't an outsider trying to steal. She wasn't a stranger manipulating from afar. She was family. She was trusted. She was involved. Jake claims Tracy had positioned herself as a helper, assisting with logistics, paperwork, streamlining legal processes as Rob and Michelle aged. On paper, that sounds responsible. In reality, it's the perfect cover. Because when you're the one organizing, explaining, and translating legal language, you control the narrative. And if you're just a little dishonest, just a little, no one notices until it's too late. Jake doesn't allege sloppy mistakes. He alleges intentional misrepresentation. An inheritance lie. Why the inheritance mattered so much. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why would someone already wealthy risk everything over inheritance control? Because inheritance isn't just money. It's legacy. It's validation. It's proof that you were chosen. Jake suggests Tracy didn't just want her share, she wanted dominance. To decide who got what, who mattered, who stayed dependent, who stayed silent. And if that's true, then Nick's position suddenly makes sense. Nick wasn't just the problem child. He was a wild card. Someone who knew things. Someone who could talk. Someone whose silence was suddenly worth $50 million. The moment Rob realized the truth. Jake describes the moment his father woke up as subtle but devastating. Rob wasn't screaming. He wasn't threatening. He was disappointed. And in families like this, disappointment is more dangerous than anger. Jake claims Rob confronted Tracy with evidence, discrepancies, inconsistencies, questions she couldn't deflect. And Tracy didn't deny everything. She deflected. She minimized. She reframed. Classic tactics when someone is caught. Not fully, but enough to panic. Because Rob wasn't just questioning documents. He was questioning trust. And once trust cracks, the entire structure collapses. The fear that followed. This is the part Jake emphasizes most. After the confrontation, Tracy didn't calm down. She accelerated. Phone calls increased. Meetings happened quietly. And then, the wire transfer. Jake believes Tracy knew she had crossed a point of no return. If Rob went public, or even just went to an attorney, everything would unravel. Careers, reputations, relationships. So instead of backing down, she made a move. A drastic one. She paid for silence. Why Nick was the key. Here's the brutal logic Jake outlines. If the inheritance manipulation came to light, Nick could confirm it. Nick had proximity. Nick had knowledge. Nick had motive to speak, resentment, exclusion, years of being sidelined. But Nick also had something else. Vulnerability. And vulnerable people are easier to control with money than with threats. $50 million wasn't just hush money. It was identity replacement. It transformed Nick from the liability into the asset. The one person Tracy needed on her side. The silence pact takes shape. Jake believes the deal was implicit, not written. No contracts. No signatures. Just understanding. Money in exchange for loyalty. Silence in exchange for survival. And maybe this is the part that makes prosecutors nervous, something even darker. Jake claims the phrase used wasn't, if something comes out. It was, if something goes wrong. That distinction matters. Because something goes wrong doesn't mean exposure. It means chaos. It means consequences. It means someone takes the fall. The inheritance lie becomes a time bomb. From that moment on, the family dynamic shifted. Jake felt it. Romy noticed it. Even Rob seemed heavier, more guarded. The house wasn't loud. It was tense. Like everyone was waiting for something to explode. And when people live like that long enough, one thing is guaranteed. Eventually it does. The question no one asked in time. Here's the question Jake keeps asking, and the one no one wants to answer. If the inheritance line never happened, would Rob and Michelle still be alive? Because if the confrontation never occurred, the wire transfer never happens. If the wire transfer never happens, the silence pact never exists. And if the silence pact never exists, then Nick never becomes the designated fall guy. Everything traces back to that lie. A quiet manipulation that turned a family into a battlefield. And the most chilling part? Jake believes the lie wasn't even finished doing damage when the murders happened. Because the inheritance issue wasn't resolved. It was escalating. Rob wasn't backing down. And Tracy was running out of time. What happens when the man who built the empire starts pulling on the thread that could unravel it all? There's always a moment, a singular moment, when everything shifts. The tone in a conversation. The silence after a sentence lands too hard. The way a door closes just a little slower than usual. Jake Reiner says that moment happened inside the walls of the Brentwood estate. Between father and daughter. Between truth and ruin. And what he claims Rob Reiner confronted Tracy about didn't just threaten money. It threatened everything. A father's rage, cloaked in disappointment. Let's be clear, Rob Reiner was not a man easily shaken. By the time this confrontation happened, he had stood toe-to-toe with studio executives, lawmakers, journalists, and activists. He'd built a career off confrontation, calm, cutting, and surgically effective. But this time, it wasn't about Hollywood. It wasn't about politics. It was about betrayal. Family betrayal. And Jake says when Rob discovered what Tracy had done, the inheritance manipulation, the quiet financial redirection, he didn't erupt. He tightened. He turned cold. Measured. Laser-focused. That kind of quiet fury? It's far more terrifying than shouting. Because it means the person you just betrayed isn't emotional. They're calculating. And Tracy must have seen that too. A conversation no one was supposed to hear. Jake wasn't in the room. He's honest about that. But what he does say is that he heard enough from the hallway. Raised voices, not shouting, but sharp. Rob's voice, steady and low. Tracy's, increasingly desperate. Words like, "This wasn't what we agreed. You altered the terms. You crossed the line." And then, silence. The kind of silence that wraps around the air like fog. Then a door closed. And nothing was ever the same after that. Why this fight was different? The Reiners had arguments before. Jake admits it. Politics. Career choices. Public statements. All standard family heat, especially in a household that large and high profile. But this was different. Because this wasn't about what someone said. It was about what someone did. If Jake's account is accurate, Rob had uncovered concrete proof that Tracy had been diverting control over the family's assets, specifically his legacy trusts, charitable foundations, and estate disbursements. This wasn't a mistake. It was a power grab. And Rob wasn't about to let it slide. He was reportedly prepared to go to the family's lawyers, to restructure, to correct, to expose. And for Tracy, that would have meant public disgrace, possibly even criminal investigation. Tracy's alleged ultimatum. Here's where things twist in a way no one saw coming. Jake alleges that following Rob's confrontation, Tracy didn't apologize. She made a countermove, a desperate one. She went to Nick. And this is where everything changes. Because Jake believes that Tracy, knowing Rob was preparing to act, to possibly rewrite the will, involve legal teams, maybe even press charges, tried to contain the fallout by shifting the burden. She allegedly told Nick, "If Dad does this, we're all exposed. I need your help. You owe me. I can fix this, but only if you stay quiet." Nick, already resentful, already unstable, already struggling to find purpose in a family that rarely gave him one, now finally needed. And not just needed. Paid. Jake claims that within 72 hours of the confrontation, the $50 million wire transfer was completed. And Nick was no longer just the black sheep. He was the failsafe, Rob's last act of defiance. Here's the part that breaks your heart. Jake believes Rob suspected what was coming. Not the murders. No one could predict that horror. But the betrayal, the fracture, the possibility that someone he loved would try to erase his legacy to elevate their own. In his final days, Rob reportedly began organizing paperwork, reaching out to longtime advisors, and drafting new legal directives. He was preparing for war, but time was not on his side. Jake doesn't know whether Rob intended to disown Tracy, or press charges, or simply restructure the estate in a way that protected the family from itself. All he knows is that Rob was about to act, and someone else knew too, because that's when everything exploded. The final dinner. There was one more dinner. A family gathering. Quiet, uneventful, on the surface. Rob, Michelle, Tracy, Romy, Jake, and Nick, watching, always watching. No one remembers what was served, but they all remember how it felt. Heavy, loaded, false smiles, awkward jokes, like everyone knew something was about to snap, but no one knew when. And then the dinner ended. And the next time Jake saw his parents, they were in the morgue. Did the confrontation seal Rob's fate? This is the haunting question. Jake doesn't want to believe that confronting Tracy caused the murders, but he does believe it triggered something. A chain reaction. One that forced people to make impossible choices or dangerous ones. He believes Tracy realized she couldn't contain the truth, so she acted fast. Too fast. And Nick? He was already in position. Not as a killer, as a shield. The guest house light. There's one detail that sticks with Jake. The night of the murders, he drove past the estate. Didn't go in. Didn't stop. But he saw one thing. The light in the guest house was still on. Flickering. Like someone had walked in and never left. That image won't leave him. And the question that haunts him more than anything else. Did Nick already know what had to be done? Because what came next would turn a private family dispute into a national crime scene. Who sends $50 million in silence? And why does no one stop them? A wire transfer is cold, unemotional, instant, efficient, no fingerprints, no weapons, just numbers on a screen, and consequences that can't be undone. And according to Jake Reiner, that's exactly how the most important move in this entire tragedy was made. Not with a scream, not with blood, but with a quiet transaction that may have triggered everything that followed. A transaction with no explanation. Let's start here. What would you do if your sibling wired you $50 million out of the blue? No warning, no context, just a transfer that large into your account. Overnight, would you call them? Ask why? Report it? Or would you stay quiet because you already knew the reason? That's the position Nick Reiner allegedly found himself in. But according to Jake, he didn't ask questions because he knew exactly what the money was for. Following the money. Jake doesn't speculate about bank names, routing numbers, or currencies. He doesn't need to, because what he does claim is far more disturbing. The money was wired directly from Tracy Reiner's offshore holding account, one tied to her production company. It landed in an LLC Nick had recently formed, supposedly to launch a documentary about family truth. The transfer happened 2 weeks before the murders. Let that timing sink in. And now ask yourself, why does someone send that kind of money before anything happens, unless they're trying to buy the future? Tracy's alleged motive. Jake lays it out plainly. This wasn't generosity. This wasn't guilt. It was strategy. Jake believes Tracy wired the money for 3 chilling reasons. To shut Nick up regarding the alleged inheritance fraud. To bind him to her, creating financial dependence and emotional leverage. To ensure he would handle it if things with Rob escalated. But what does handle it mean? Was it literal violence? Jake says no. He doesn't believe Tracy intended murder. He believes she intended containment. That Nick would act as the shield, the scapegoat, the fall guy, if the family blew up. The $50 million wasn't hush money. It was contractual silence, with conditions that had deadly implications. Nick's behavior after the transfer. Here's where things get strange. After the wire landed, Nick stopped contacting Jake and Romy entirely, canceled therapy sessions, told a friend in rehab that he was finally in control, was seen purchasing several expensive items, watches, computers, cameras, all in cash. A close source says Nick even jokingly said, "Turns out silence is golden, and I just hit the jackpot." Was it a joke? Was it sarcasm? Or was it the truth, slipping out of his mouth when he thought no one was listening? Who else knew? Now here's the kicker. No one else in the family knew about the money. Not Jake, not Romy, not Rob, not Michelle. Tracy kept it hidden, off books, untraceable by family attorneys, buried under corporate noise. Jake only discovered it after the murders, when a whistleblower, a former assistant of Tracy's, sent him screenshots of financial activity that didn't match public records. Why would someone leak that? Because guilt has a funny way of turning insiders into whistleblowers. And once Jake saw the proof, everything clicked. The price of silence. Why $50 million? It's an absurd number. You don't give someone that kind of cash unless the cost of what they know is even higher. Jake believes the inheritance fraud, the financial manipulation Tracy was allegedly involved in, wasn't just internal family drama. It involved tax shelters, foundation diversions, and potentially charitable fraud. If that got out, Tracy could go to prison. Her career would be obliterated. Everything she had built would crumble. So instead of risking exposure, she made a deal. A $50 million silence pact with the most unstable member of the family. And that's where everything began to unravel. Rob never saw it coming. Rob was many things. But paranoid? No. He trusted his kids, even when they disappointed him, even when they hurt him. But what he never imagined, according to Jake, was that 2 of them might have made a private agreement behind his back. One to stay in power, one to take the fall. And by the time he started digging into the inheritance documents, the money had already moved. The trap had already been set. Jake's deepest regret. Jake admits this openly. I saw Nick pulling away. I felt it. I just didn't know why. He thought it was stress, or grief, or anger at being left out again. But now, looking back, Jake believes Nick was spiraling because he was locked into a deal he couldn't escape. And when the family finally imploded, Nick didn't run. He waited, because he knew what the money meant. He knew what he'd been bought to do. The timeline that changed everything. Let's line it up. Rob confronts Tracy about financial manipulation. Tracy panics, sees exposure coming. She wires $50 million to Nick, allegedly telling him to keep this in the family, no matter what happens. Rob prepares legal action. Days later, Rob and Michelle are murdered. Nick is found on the property. He doesn't resist. He doesn't speak. Until now, in custody, he still hasn't broken his silence. Jake believes that silence, bought with blood money, is the real confession. But there's one thing Jake never expected. That Tracy, after the murders, didn't run. She stayed. She smiled at the press. She gave statements of sorrow. And behind closed doors, she deleted messages, burned documents, and acted like none of it had ever happened. What would you do if silence became your only form of survival, but also your slowest form of destruction? Some deals are written. Others are signed with bloodless understanding. No words, just glances. This was the latter. According to Jake Reiner, the agreement between Tracy and Nick wasn't on paper. It didn't need to be, because both of them understood what was at stake. And in families where betrayal has already slipped through the cracks, silence becomes the only thing anyone is left to sell. But this pact? It wasn't just silence for silence's sake. It was silence weaponized. And it came with one clause no one saw coming. If everything collapses, you take the fall. No witnesses. No paper trail. Just a pact. Let's rewind to the aftermath of the alleged inheritance confrontation. Reiner had cornered Tracy, figuratively, if not literally. He knew something was off. He was preparing to expose it. He may have even been drafting new wills or calling his lawyers. And Tracy? Cornered, anxious, and watching her entire empire teeter on the edge, made her most dangerous move yet. She approached Nick, and she didn't say, "Let's talk." She said, in essence, "This stays between us. Forever. You do your part, and I'll make sure you're taken care of." Jake calls it the Pact of Shadows. Because everyone involved was already operating in the dark, and that's how they liked it. How a pact like this works. In elite families, silence isn't earned. It's enforced. Through favors. Through pressure. Through control. Jake describes Tracy's behavior as legal mafia. Smooth, professional, but unmistakably threatening. Here's how he believes it broke down. Tracy promised protection, both legal and financial. Nick agreed not to expose the inheritance fraud Tracy allegedly committed. If Rob moved forward legally, Nick would take responsibility for whatever fallout happened, even if that meant becoming the villain. And here's the truly chilling part. That responsibility may have extended to murder, not necessarily committing it, but owning it. Jake believes the phrase used was, "If anything happens, you deal with it." Intentionally vague. Intentionally sinister. Why Nick said yes. Nick Reiner wasn't stupid. Troubled? Yes. Angry? Absolutely. But not stupid. So why agree to a deal like this? Because for the first time in his life, he had leverage. Jake says Nick had always felt like an afterthought. The Reiner family, no one wanted. But now, for once, he was the most valuable person in the room. Tracy needed him. Not Jake. Not Romy. Not even Michelle. Nick. And for a man who had spent years feeling invisible, a deal that made him matter, even in a sick, twisted way, must have felt like power. Power becomes prison. But power without freedom is just another form of captivity. Jake believes that once the deal was made, Nick began unraveling. Because the pact may have bought him wealth, but it also made him a co-conspirator. Every day after that wire transfer, Nick woke up knowing. He knew something no one else did. If he spoke, he'd lose everything. If he stayed quiet, he'd protect his sister and possibly let real criminals walk free. And the worst part? If anything went wrong. He was already committed to taking the fall. Tracy's double strategy. Jake says Tracy wasn't relying on trust. She was building a failsafe. Because what happens when a silence pact breaks? When someone talks, you discredit them. You make them look unstable. You flood the narrative with enough noise that no one listens anymore. Jake believes Tracy had two strategies. Buy Nick's silence with the wire transfer. Prepare to destroy his credibility if he ever tried to speak. Because that's the real genius of the silence pact. Even if it cracks, it cannot be proven. No paper. No texts. Just a mess of he said, she said, with the unstable son and the successful daughter. Who do you think the world would believe? A pact built on emotional blackmail. Jake suggests there was another layer, even darker than money. Guilt. Tracy may have guilt Nick into the deal. Reminded him of every time the family had to clean up his mess. Every rehab stint. Every PR crisis. Every failed project. Jake believes Tracy said something along the lines of, "You owe me. This is your way to make it right." And for a man constantly drowning in regret, that kind of manipulation works. Because silence doesn't have to be forced. Sometimes it's volunteered. The weight of the deal. Friends close to Nick say he was different after the wire. He drank less. He dressed better. He even posted inspirational quotes about starting over. But the look in his eyes? Haunted. One friend said, it was like he knew something terrible was coming, and he'd already decided he deserved it. That's not peace. That's resignation. The kind that only comes when you've made a deal you can't escape. Not even with money. Not even with family. And then the pact was broken. Jake doesn't know what broke the deal. Maybe Rob moved too quickly. Maybe Tracy panicked. Maybe Nick cracked. But something changed. Because 2 weeks after the wire, Rob and Michelle Reiner were dead. Nick was arrested, and Tracy was silent, calm, calculated. The one person who supposedly had nothing to do with anything was suddenly acting like she knew exactly how this would play out. And maybe she did, because if Jake is right, this was her plan all along. But what came next, even Tracy couldn't control, because Nick may have gone silent. But Romy? She was about to say something that shattered every assumption. What if the most explosive truth of all came not from the accused, but from the youngest witness the world ignored? Romy Reiner had always been the quiet one. No public scandals, no screaming matches, no tabloid drama. She kept her distance, not just from the spotlight, but from the entire circus surrounding her last name. But sometimes, it's the quiet ones who carry the sharpest memories. And when Romy finally broke her silence, she didn't just talk. She pointed to a person, to a pattern, to a warning her family never took seriously. Because while everyone was focused on Nick, Romy was focused on someone else entirely. The house that held too many secrets. Brentwood isn't just a neighborhood. It's a fortress of wealth wrapped in silence. Gated homes, long driveways, security cameras with no blind spots. Inside the Reiner estate, appearances were everything. But behind those $13.5 million walls, cracks, whispers, rooms no one entered, and one guest house, glowing into the early hours of the morning. Romy had seen it all. She'd watched it from the shadows. She didn't speak because speaking meant inviting war. But the night of the murders, something inside her broke. And what she told police wasn't what anyone expected. A call no one expected. According to early reports, Romy was the one who discovered the bodies. She'd stopped by the estate that evening, unplanned. Maybe she had a feeling. Maybe she just wanted to see her parents. But when she arrived, something was wrong. Doors unlocked. Lights flickering. Silence where there should have been laughter. And then, the discovery. We won't go into detail here. That's not the story. The story is what happened next. Romy called 911. And during that call, emotional, raw, nearly incoherent, she reportedly said something that stunned detectives. There's someone dangerous in the family. You need to talk to them. They should be a suspect. She wasn't talking about Nick. At least, not only Nick. Who was Romy referring to? This is the line everyone is dissecting. Was she talking about Tracy? Was it a warning, a deflection, a slip? Jake believes Romy was referring to a pattern of control she'd seen her entire life. Romy allegedly told officers later in a private interview. They all think Nick is unstable. But there's someone who knows how to make people break. Who knows exactly which strings to pull. The implication? That Tracy had been manipulating not just Nick, but the entire family, for years. Quietly. Strategically. Systematically. And that the final night wasn't chaos. It was choreographed. The final hours, what we know. According to leaked timelines. Rob and Michelle had dinner together early in the evening. Tracy was seen leaving the house around 7:30 p.m. Nick was in the guest house, alone. Romy arrived unexpectedly just after 9 p.m. By 9:15 p.m., the 911 call was made. That's a 90-minute window. And somewhere in that 90 minutes, something irreversible happened. Something no security footage, at least none the public has seen, has fully explained. Because despite the arrest, there are conflicting physical details. No fingerprints linking Nick directly to the weapon. No clear signs of forced entry or struggle. No indication the attack was spontaneous or frenzied. It was clinical, quick, precise, like someone was finishing a plan, not reacting to rage. Tracy's whereabouts, a convenient gap. Jake has raised alarm bells about Tracy's alibi. She claims she was at a meeting across town. There's footage of her arriving, but none of her leaving. Her phone pinged near Brentwood around 8:20 p.m. That would have given her plenty of time to return unnoticed, especially if she knew the estate layout, the camera blind spots, the staff routines. Which she did. She grew up there. She could navigate it with her eyes closed. And if, hypothetically, she returned, who would stop her? Who would question her presence? She was family. What Romy saw, or suspected. Romy has stayed quiet since the initial interview. No public statements. No press conferences. But Jake says she told him something that night, something that haunts him. It wasn't just Nick. He was scared. He looked like. He knew he had no choice. That phrasing matters. No choice. It supports Jake's belief that Nick was under psychological and financial pressure, bound by the silence pact, buried under guilt and obligation. And that someone, possibly Tracy, used that pressure as cover for something much darker. The estate that became a crime scene. When police arrived, they weren't prepared for what they found. The house was too clean. The guest house, too calm. Nick didn't run. He didn't argue. He just sat, waiting, as if he knew, as if he'd been told. Was it remorse? Was it trauma? Or was it the final act in a pact that had run its course? Jake believes Nick knew the deal was off the second Romy walked in. Because witnesses create questions, and questions lead to truth. Something this family had gone years trying to avoid. The first night in custody, Nick reportedly said very little in holding. But there's one quote, leaked by a guard, that still echoes. Tell her I kept my end. I didn't say anything. I kept my end. Who was her? Most believe he meant Tracy. If true, it's confirmation of a deal. Not just in spirit, but spoken. Remember, Tracy never came to see Nick after his arrest. No phone calls. No visits. No public defense. Just silence. The kind you use to close a chapter. The kind you use to cover tracks. Jake and Romy, a new alliance. In the days following the murders, Jake and Romy did something they hadn't done in years. They spoke. As siblings. As survivors. As the last two people in the family who still seemed to be searching for truth instead of hiding it. And what they decided. To speak. To break the pattern. To shatter the silence. To pull the threads until everything unraveled. Because if the final night in Brentwood revealed anything, it's that the story we've been told is just one version, and it's not the whole truth. But the question remains. If Nick didn't kill them, who did? And was the silence pact just the beginning of a larger, darker cover-up that still hasn't been exposed? Every murder has a discovery, but this one, it was a message, and the person who found it was never meant to see what they did. The Brentwood mansion was quiet. Too quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes with peace or late-night tranquility. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that wraps around you like a warning. Thick, cold, waiting. And then Romy opened the door. She had no idea what she was about to walk into. But once she stepped through the threshold, nothing in her family would ever be the same again. The first moments. 9:14 p.m. Brentwood, California. Romy had only come by to talk. A quick check-in. A maybe I should make sure everything's okay visit. She wasn't supposed to be there. And that, according to Jake, may be the only reason the real story ever came to light. Because the next 2 minutes would shatter everything the public thought it knew. The scene no daughter should ever walk into. We won't describe the violence. Not here. Not in detail. But understand this. What Romy saw wasn't just traumatic. It was surgical. Intentional. As if someone hadn't panicked, but planned. No forced entry. No broken windows. No overturned furniture. Nothing about the scene said fight. It said compliance. Or worse, betrayal. And then came the realization that Nick was still on the property. Not hiding. Not fleeing. Just waiting. In the guest house. Alone. Silent. Like someone expecting to be found. The 911 call that changed the narrative. The recording hasn't been released publicly. But according to law enforcement sources, Romy's 911 call was erratic. Frantic. Terrified. Yet somewhere in the middle of sobs and horror, she made a comment that sent investigators into a tailspin. He's still here. But he didn't do this. Not alone. He's scared. That single line cracked open the entire narrative. Because up until that moment, police were preparing to make a straightforward arrest. Adult son. Prior issues. Found at the scene. Case closed, right? Wrong. Romy's call made it clear. This wasn't simple. This wasn't clear-cut. This wasn't just Nick. Inside the guest house, officers approached with caution. Nick didn't resist. He was sitting on the couch, staring at the wall, unblinking. One officer later described his demeanor as, like someone waiting for the final curtain call. Not shocked. Not angry. Just finished. When asked what happened, Nick didn't respond. But he reportedly whispered something, barely audible. I kept my promise. What promise? To who? That line would echo in every interrogation room that followed. And suddenly, the murder charge wasn't the only thing being investigated. Now they were looking for the pact. The one Jake and Romy were just starting to expose. The cleanup that made things worse. Here's where things veer into disturbing territory. By the time forensic teams started documenting the crime scene, something was off. Evidence had been removed. Some digital logs, including security camera backups, were missing. External hard drives were disconnected. The estate's Wi-Fi router had been physically unplugged and rebooted just hours before the murder. Why would someone do that? It wasn't Nick. He wouldn't have known how. But Tracy? She had access. She had knowledge. She had reason. And she had been seen at the estate just the day before, helping organize documents for Rob, according to a staff member. Coincidence? Or preemptive cleanup? Jake's arrival. By the time Jake arrived, the perimeter had been secured. He was kept outside the gates. But as he stood there, phone in hand, heart pounding, he received a text. From Romy. 3 words. She did this. No context. No name. But Jake didn't need one. He knew exactly who Romy meant. And that's when everything he feared clicked into place. The beginning of the real investigation. Jake wasn't content with the surface-level arrest. He knew the family too well. He knew Tracy too well. He began compiling evidence immediately. Messages Nick had sent in the weeks prior, vague but troubled. Financial documents he'd recently received from a whistleblower showing the $50 million wire. Voice memos from Rob. One in particular where he hinted, "I think Tracy's trying to outmaneuver me." All of it pointed to something deeper, darker, premeditated. And Jake handed everything to authorities. He wasn't just speaking out. He was building a case. Public reaction. As news of the Reiner murders broke, media coverage was chaotic. Most headlines focused on Nick. Troubled son arrested in Hollywood homicide. Reiner family tragedy. Guest house horror. From addiction to accusation. What happened to Nick Reiner? But within days, Jake's name surfaced. Then Romy's. And then came the whispers. The wire. The pact. The possibility that the murder wasn't a meltdown, but a cover-up gone wrong. And suddenly, the public wasn't sure who the real villain was. Nick's silence speaks volumes. Since his arrest, Nick has refused to talk. Not a single public statement. No confessions. No denials. Just silence. But in his silence, Jake hears the deal. "I took the fall. You walk free. We never speak of this again." It was never meant to fall apart. But the discovery, the timing of Romy's arrival, blew it wide open. The pact was exposed. The truth began leaking. And now, there was no way to contain it. But the next leak didn't come from Jake. It came from inside the Brentwood Police Department. A transcript. A conversation recorded in secret. One that included names, timelines, and one voice no one expected to hear. They arrested the wrong person. And the one who made sure of it was already erasing her footprints. Brentwood police were confident. They had a suspect. They had a scene. They had motive, opportunity, even proximity. And when Nick Reiner was found calmly sitting in the guest house, silent, unemotional, alone, it felt like an open and shut case. But in Jake Reiner's words, they didn't arrest a killer. They arrested a contract. Because Nick wasn't running. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't even surprised. Because if Jake's theory holds up, Nick always knew this moment was coming. And he'd already agreed to play his part. The illusion of resolution. Let's break it down. When police arrived at the scene and found Rob and Michelle Reiner murdered, no signs of forced entry, no external suspects. The natural conclusion pointed toward someone close. And who was closer than the son living 200 feet away? Nick Reiner was detained without resistance. He barely spoke. Didn't ask why. Didn't protest. He just let them cuff him and walked out of the house his parents died in. Media headlines exploded within hours. Nick Reiner arrested for double murder of parents. Son of Rob Reiner accused of brutal killing. Hollywood tragedy. Reiner legacy ends in horror. But behind those headlines, Jake and Romy were scrambling. Because they knew this story didn't add up. The arrest wasn't the climax. It was the first act. Romy's 911 call had already raised flags. Jake's timeline and financial evidence was about to send shockwaves. And then came the leak. A recorded conversation, smuggled out of the Brentwood Police Department, handed to Jake anonymously. A transcript between Tracy and an unknown male voice, captured just days before the murders. The audio hasn't been authenticated publicly, but in the transcript, Tracy allegedly says, "If it comes to it, he'll handle it. I wired him enough to remember what silence is worth." And then, Nick knows the stakes. I've protected him his whole life. This is his chance to repay that. If real, that's not protection. That's orchestration. Nick in custody, a puzzle of silence. Officers who processed Nick describe him as composed, uncooperative, muted. He didn't ask for a lawyer immediately. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He stared at the table. When asked if he knew why he was there, he nodded once. When asked if he understood the charges, he said, "It's all part of it." Again. Vague, cryptic, hollow. But to Jake, it was proof. Proof that Nick wasn't confessing. He was complying. Public backlash versus private panic. While the world tore Nick apart online, behind the scenes, Jake and Romy were making moves. They hired a private investigator, collected security footage from surrounding properties, contacted 2 former Reiner estate employees who had left under mysterious circumstances, both of whom described Tracy as the only one who knew where the real documents were kept. And then came the most damning detail. Tracy's voice on a second recording, casually asking her assistant the day before the murders, "Are the backups erased from the server room?" That server held estate documents, camera logs,